The wedding coordinator did not even look me in the eye when she spoke. "You will be in row 14, next to the service area," she said in a flat, efficient tone, as if she were moving a chair instead of a person. Beside her, my future daughter-in-law smiled with a kind of polished sweetness that felt colder than ice. "My family cannot lose face," she added, turning her head just enough for me to hear. "If your poverty shows, people will talk." My son stood a little behind them, in a tailored suit he had not bought with the coins he once saved in a glass jar on our kitchen counter. His shoulders were straight, his hair immaculate, his tie the color of old money. When his wife said the word poverty, I watched his face. I waited for the slightest flicker of indignation, one word of protest, a single gentle look in my direction. Instead, Bryce lowered his gaze to his polished shoes and said nothing at all. In that silence, something inside my chest gave a slow, painful twist. I had been a widow for 10 years. I had spent more than 40 years in a public school classroom on the south side of Chicago, raising a boy into a man on a teacher's salary and 1,000 small sacrifices. I had buried my husband with my own 2 hands, or at least it felt that way, and learned to sit in a quiet house without anyone to ask me how my day was. Yet somehow, none of that hurt as sharply as the sight of my son pretending not to hear his bride apologize for me before the ceremony had even begun. The Devon estate was the kind of place I had only ever seen in glossy magazines on the coffee table at the dentist's office. The hall glittered with chandeliers that seemed to tangle in their own light. Crystal flutes winked on tables draped in white, so crisp it almost crackled. Waiters glided by carrying trays of champagne I could not pronounce. White roses cascaded from tall vases like something out of a royal wedding. Everywhere I turned, I saw designer labels, sleek hair, polished nails. I smoothed the front of my navy dress, the one I wore on special occasions. It was clean, carefully pressed, and at least 10 years old. In that sea of silk and couture, I felt like an ink smudge on a page of expensive stationery. A young staff member in a black vest and white shirt led me down the aisle with the discreet, apologetic smile of someone used to carrying other people's embarrassment. We passed row after row of polished guests, their perfume trailing in the air like faint accusations. I recognized some of the faces from the engagement party. They were the kind of people who gave to charities and still somehow managed to make generosity feel like a performance. Near the front, seated where the cameras would linger, was Camille's mother, Patricia Devon, in pearls that looked older than my career. She watched me walk by as if I were a misplaced piece of furniture that someone had pushed into view. "Is that the groom's mother?" one of the women beside her whispered. Not quietly enough. I heard she taught at a public school. Must have been rough. Another woman leaned in, her laugh soft and sharp at the same time. I heard she had to work extra hours at a library just to make ends meet. I kept walking, my back straight, my hands steady at my sides. I had faced teenagers in full rebellion, cancer test results, and an empty side of the bed. I would not let these women see my hands shake. Still, as the staff member stopped at the very last row and gestured toward a cold folding chair near the service station, I felt the humiliation like a hand on the back of my neck. Row 14. Behind the flower handlers, behind the sound crew, behind the photographers who would never once turn their lenses toward me. Behind the service area, where staff would slip in and out carrying dirty plates as if I were part of that traffic. The mother of the groom seated where no one needed to see her. "Thank you," I said, because polite words were a habit I had not yet unlearned. I sat down carefully, clutching my small clutch bag in both hands. From here, the altar looked distant, like a stage where actors performed a story that had very little to do with me. Bryce stood at the front in his dark suit, looking taller than I remembered, more at ease in this world of polished silver and polished people than I had ever seen him in our cramped kitchen. The string quartet played something delicate and expensive sounding. Guests murmured. Cameras flashed. My son laughed at something whispered by his best man, and for a moment I saw the little boy who had once burst through our front door with muddy sleeves and a fistful of dandelions. "Mom, these are for you," he had said then, grinning so wide he could barely keep his eyes open. "You are the prettiest in the world." I felt my throat tighten around the memory. Where had that boy gone? When had he grown into a man who could listen to his wife call his mother an embarrassment and find no words to disagree? The music shifted. People turned. The doors at the far end of the hall opened, and Camille appeared, radiant in white. Her gown spilled around her like a cloud, the train long enough to require 2 attendants. Diamonds glittered at her throat and ears, catching the light until I had to blink. She moved slowly down the aisle, her face composed, her eyes fixed on Bryce. She passed my row without a flicker of recognition, as though the chair beside the service station contained air rather than a woman who had given birth to her groom. I tried to make myself small, to fold my hurt into a quiet corner of my chest and focus on the vows that would soon be spoken. But the conversations from the nearby tables drifted toward me in fragments, as if the room itself refused to let me disappear. "She looks tired." "Well, public schools will do that to you. At least the Devons will bring some elegance into the family." The words pricked like thorns, but I stayed sitting upright, my hands clasped in my lap. I had learned long ago that collapsing never made the fall easier. Still, as the officiant began to speak, the weight of all those polished eyes turned away from me. I felt an ache so deep it made my vision blur around the edges. Just then, the chair beside mine scraped softly against the floor. I turned, surprised. No one had been assigned this seat. It had been left empty, the way restaurants sometimes leave a chair near the kitchen door, more convenience than invitation. A man lowered himself into it with unhurried grace. He was older, his hair a striking silver that caught the light like polished steel. His suit was black and perfectly cut. A subtle scent of bergamot, and something darker, more expensive, drifted from him. There was nothing loud about his appearance, yet my eyes knew at once that this was not a man accustomed to sitting in the last row of anything. "Excuse me," I began instinctively. "I think there has been a mistake. This seat is by the service area." Without looking at me, he reached out and gently laid his hand over mine. His touch was warm, firm, and impossibly steady. "Let us pretend we came together," he said quietly. "It will be easier that way." For a heartbeat, I could not move. The hall, with its music and its flowers and its glittering cruelty, seemed to tilt on its axis. I should have pulled my hand away. I should have protested. Instead, some part of me that had been braced for impact all afternoon loosened by a fraction. From the front rows, I felt the shift before I fully understood it. Heads turned. A woman in a feathered hat tilted her head, squinting in our direction. "Who is that man with the groom's mother?" someone whispered. "He looks important." Another voice answered, low and doubtful. "I have seen him somewhere before. Was he not on the cover of Forbes a few years back?" I still did not look directly at him, but in the edge of my vision I saw the faintest curve of a smile at the corner of his mouth, as if this amused him in some private way. At the altar, Bryce glanced out over the crowd, his eyes scanning the guests with the easy habit of someone used to being observed. His gaze slid past the first rows, past the photographers, past the flower arrangements, and then stopped. His face went still. For a long second, my son stared directly at us. His complexion, so carefully warmed by makeup for the photographer's sake, drained a shade paler. His lips parted slightly, as if a question had risen to the back of his throat and lodged there. Beside him, Camille followed his line of sight. When she saw me, not alone in the last row, but seated with a man whose presence bent the attention of the room, her hand tightened visibly around her bouquet. The polished smile on her face faltered, then froze. I did not yet know what game I had been invited into, or why a stranger with silver hair and a watch that probably cost more than my car would choose to sit beside a woman in an old navy dress. I only knew that the air around us had changed. Where there had been pity, there was curiosity. Where there had been contempt, there was caution. "I do not understand what you are doing," I murmured, barely moving my lips. "Do not look at me," he replied in the same low tone. "Just smile. Your son is about to look again." Obedience was not a habit I practiced with strangers, yet somehow I did as he said. I lifted my chin, let my mouth soften into a small, calm smile, and fixed my gaze somewhere above the officiant's shoulder, as if I had spent my life among crystal chandeliers. When Bryce looked down the second time, the change in his expression was unmistakable. In the very spot where he had arranged for his mother to be hidden from sight, I was now sitting beside a man whose presence radiated quiet authority, the kind that did not need an introduction. "Perfect," the stranger murmured, his fingers giving mine the smallest reassuring squeeze. "Now they do not know where to place you in their picture." My heart beat unevenly in my chest. "Who are you?" I asked under my breath. He turned his head at last, and his eyes met mine fully for the first time. They were a deep, startling blue, exactly the shade of a summer sky over Lake Michigan years ago, when the wind had tangled my hair on a park bench and a young man had read poetry to me as if it were a sacred act. "Someone you should have crossed paths with again a long time ago," he said softly. For a moment every sound in the hall blurred. The music, the rustle of silk, the murmur of wealth bending over itself, all faded to a distant hum. I saw only those blue eyes, older now, threaded with fine lines at the corners, and yet unmistakable. "Sebastian," I whispered, the name catching on my breath like a long-forgotten note. He smiled, slow and sure. "Call me Seb, Mabel, the way you used to." My name on his tongue after so many decades felt like the first deep breath after years of shallow ones. I sat there, in row 14, with the clink of glassware and the vows beginning to rise in the air, and understood with sudden clarity that this day would not unfold the way the Devons had planned. They had placed me by the service station to erase me from the story. They had no idea that from this moment on, the person being quietly removed from their place would not be me. If you are still listening, wherever you are in this wide world, I want you to stay with me. This is not only a story about a wedding, it is about the day a woman seated in the last row decided never to sit there again. The ceremony continued at the front of the hall, as if nothing in the last row had shifted, yet inside me everything felt unsteady, as though a door that had been locked since my youth had suddenly cracked open. I tried to listen to the vows, to the soft rise and fall of the minister's voice, but the world felt distant, muted, like a radio signal drifting in and out. The man beside me sat with a composure that seemed carved rather than worn, the kind that grows only from years of knowing who you are and what you can weather. His presence radiated a quiet steadiness that reached me even before I had gathered the courage to fully look at him. The last time I had seen Sebastian Whitmore, neither of us had silver hair. Neither of us had the lines that now traced our faces like gentle maps of all the sorrow and joy we had endured. The last time I saw him, we had been standing at the old train station off 22nd Street, the smell of iron and diesel in the air. He had promised to write every week. I had promised to wait. I remembered the warmth of his hands over mine, the certainty in his voice, the hope in my chest that made the world feel bigger than any hardship I had ever known. I had waited. For months I had waited, checking the mailbox each afternoon, listening for the ring of the phone, standing at the front window as autumn turned to winter, then winter to spring. Each day, nothing came. No letter, no call, no explanation. I had believed then that love could crumble in an instant, and that silence was a kind of answer. And so, eventually, I folded that tender part of myself away, pressed it into the pages of a life that needed my attention, a life of lesson plans, parent-teacher conferences, grocery lists, hospital visits, and the steady, unglamorous courage required to build a home on a teacher's salary and 1,000 quiet sacrifices. Now, decades later, his presence beside me felt both impossible and inevitable, like the return of a long-forgotten melody that rises effortlessly to the tongue. I studied him now, only in brief glances. His hair, silver and thick, caught the ambient glow of the chandeliers. His profile was still sharp, the strong brow, the distinct line of his jaw. Time had deepened his features but not diminished them. He carried himself with an effortless authority that came from years spent navigating rooms where power was spoken in footnotes and signatures rather than raised voices. As the minister invited the couple to exchange vows, Seb shifted in his seat, leaning slightly toward me. His tone was low, meant for me alone. "You are doing well," he whispered. "They are watching you. Not because of the row you are in, but because they cannot understand how you came to sit with me." I drew in a slow breath. "Why are you helping me?" I asked, my voice barely above a murmur. "After all these years, why now and why here?" His eyes softened with something almost sorrowful. "Because I should have been here a long time ago. Because you should never have been seated in the last row of anything." A tremble of emotion rose in my chest so swiftly I had to look away to steady myself. I was not a woman who broke easily. Life had seen to that. But there was something disarming about hearing a man speak to me with a kind of reverence I had not felt in years, perhaps not since the days when he had read to me on my parents' porch with a worn copy of Whitman and a hope that felt too large for our young bodies to hold. The ceremony moved forward, each vow echoing in the expansive room. Guests dabbed at their eyes with linen napkins, though I wondered how many tears were for the moment and how many for the performance. When the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, the crowd burst into applause. I clapped as well, though the sound felt hollow in my hands. As people stood and began to file toward the reception hall, I remained seated a moment longer, needing a breath of stillness before thrusting myself into a sea of polite smiles and distant eyes. Seb waited without urging me. When I finally rose, he placed his hand lightly at the small of my back, guiding me with a gentleness I had not expected. We walked toward the French doors leading to the garden. Outside, the afternoon sun cast long bands of gold across the manicured lawn. Lavender bushes lined the pathways, their scent lifting into the air on a warm breeze. The sound of the reception behind us softened until it faded to a distant hum. Once we were far enough from the crowd, Seb spoke again. "I looked for you," he said, his voice steady but threaded with an old ache. "For years, Mabel. I sent letters every week from London. I called until the operator told me there was no one by your name at your old number. When I returned, I went to the address you had lived in. A new family lived there. Your mother told me you had moved on. She said you wanted a different life. She said it was time for me to let you go." I stopped walking. The breeze pressed gently at my shoulders, carrying the faint scent of lavender mixed with the distant perfume of roses. My eyes stung, not with the sharpness of humiliation, but with something slower, deeper, older. "My mother," I whispered. "She did not approve of you. She thought you were a risk. She believed stability mattered more than passion, more than poetry, more than two young people who could barely keep their hands from reaching for each other. She wanted me to marry someone steady, someone safe, someone like Harold." Seb nodded slowly, absorbing my words with a quiet resignation. I suspected as much. Still, I tried. Twice I returned to Chicago. I walked past the old house. Once I saw a light in the window, hoped it was you, but it was not. The second time I saw your wedding announcement in the paper, that was when I knew the door had closed, whether by choice or by circumstance. "Harold was a good man," I said, my voice gentle. "Truly good. He gave me a life built on kindness. He was steady, patient, devoted. We raised Bryce together. We built a home together. But the spark, the one I used to feel whenever you walked into a room, I buried that long ago. Not out of resentment, but out of necessity." Seb's gaze shifted to the distant edge of the garden, where the sunlight touched the lake in a bright shimmer. "I never married," he said quietly. "I met women who were wonderful in their own ways. Intelligent, accomplished, kind, but each time I found myself comparing them to you. It was not fair to them, so I stopped trying." I inhaled deeply, letting the truth settle in the spaces of my ribcage. It felt unreal, hearing him say these things in the soft quiet of the garden, with the echo of vows still floating faintly in the air. So much of my life had been about caring for others, about being responsible, about surviving the quiet loneliness of losing a husband and raising a son who had grown into a man I barely recognized. And here was Seb, a man I had once believed abandoned me, telling me he had carried the memory of me through the decades. We walked in silence for several moments, the gravel crunching beneath our feet. Finally, he turned to me again. "Do not blame yourself for the past, Mabel. We were young. We trusted the people around us. We did what we thought would keep the world steady. Life pulled us in different directions. It does that sometimes." I nodded slowly. "I know. But I wonder, sometimes, what would have happened if the letters had reached me? If the phone had rung and no one had erased your messages? If I had known you still wanted me?" Seb stopped walking then, and his voice grew softer. "I would have married you," he said. "Without hesitation. I would have asked you to come with me to London. I would have built a life with you. A different one than you lived. Not better, not worse. Just different. But perhaps we were meant to meet again now, when we have both lived enough years to understand what matters and what does not." We reached a stone bench near a small pond where koi swam lazily beneath the surface. The sunlight rippled across the water in bright fragments. Seb gestured for me to sit. When he sat beside me, he drew a small object from his suit pocket. It was an old photograph, worn at the corners, its edges yellowed with age. I recognized myself instantly. My 20-year-old self smiling brightly, holding a fistful of wildflowers he had gathered for me. My hair was caught in the summer wind, my eyes bright with a kind of innocence I could barely remember now. "I kept this with me," he said quietly. "Since 1972. My breath hitched. I thought you would have thrown that away long ago. Seb shook his head. No. I once believed if I kept it, I would never love anyone else. Later, I understood that keeping it was not about refusing to move on. It was about honoring what had been true once, even if life carried us far from it. I looked down at the photograph, my fingers tracing the young woman I used to be. I loved Harold, I whispered. I did, but he never saw me the way you did. Our marriage was peaceful, responsible, respectful. But it did not have the spark. Maybe I learned to live without being truly seen. Seb exhaled slowly. And I lived all these years seeing only one pair of eyes, even when they were no longer before me. The breeze rustled the lavender behind us, and for a moment the scent brought back every summer of my youth. The days when I used to steal olives from Seb's salad at Romano's, and he would catch me because he counted them. The nights we spent reading poetry on the front steps. The feeling of believing the world would bend for us simply because we loved each other. I do not know if we can reclaim what we lost, I said finally. We are older now. Life has shaped us in ways we could not have imagined back then. Seb nodded, his expression gentle. We do not need to reclaim the past, Mabel. We only need to choose what comes next. The simplicity of his words settled deep within me, like stones falling into place. For the first time in a long while, I felt a new space open inside me. Not youth, not naive hope, but something steadier. Something that felt like a second sunrise in a life I had believed was already well into the afternoon. We sat on the bench as the reception music drifted faintly from the hall. The clinking of glasses, the distant laughter, the start of a celebration I no longer felt excluded from. Because in that moment, I was not the woman seated by the service station. I was not the mother whose poverty was whispered about. I was simply Mabel, a woman who had survived heartbreak and humiliation and still found herself standing. And beside me was the man who had once known my heart better than I knew it myself, walking back into my life not as a ghost from the past but as a possibility for the future. When Seb finally stood and offered me his hand, I placed mine in his without hesitation. The warmth of his palm closed around mine with a familiarity that felt like a promise. Come, he said softly. There is more I need to tell you, and you deserve to hear all of it. I rose, and together we walked into the soft glow of the evening, unaware that the path ahead would lead not only to confrontation, but to the rediscovery of dignity, strength, and the quiet but powerful truth that even the most overlooked lives can shift the ground beneath those who once stood above them. We walked slowly along the garden path, our steps quiet on the gravel, the sky above us softening into the muted gold of late afternoon. The air had a stillness that felt suspended between two worlds, one behind me and one just beginning to emerge ahead. I sensed that Seb was choosing his words carefully, as though he wanted to offer the truth without stirring the old wounds too suddenly. When we reached a shaded corner of the garden where a stone fountain murmured softly, he stopped. For a brief moment he looked at the water instead of at me. I realized then that whatever he was about to say had lived inside him for a very long time. There is something else, Mabel, he began, something I never had the chance to tell you. After London, after the letters and the calls and the silences, I came back to Chicago with one intention. I wanted to see you, even if it meant you would tell me in person that you had moved on. I was prepared for heartbreak, but I was not prepared for your mother meeting me at the door. I felt the familiar tightness return in my chest, the same one that always appeared when I thought about the choices my mother had made out of fear, pride, or love. Or perhaps all three combined into one fierce and sometimes damaging instinct. What did she say to you? I asked quietly. Seb drew in a slow breath. She told me you had outgrown whatever we had. She said you had met someone who came from a better family, someone who could offer you stability and respectability. She said I should not embarrass myself by lingering around your life. She said you were happy. I closed my eyes. My mother had always believed that strong feelings were a luxury reserved for people who could afford heartbreak. She saw life as a series of necessary compromises, and she believed she was preserving me by pushing away anything she viewed as uncertain. I had never known she had spoken to him directly. The realization settled over me like a veil. Seb watched me with a mixture of gentleness and something like regret. I left that day with a kind of grief I did not know how to name. I told myself it was fate. I told myself you had chosen the path that made the most sense for you. But underneath all of that, I carried a quiet question that never stopped echoing. What if your mother had been wrong? I sat down on the edge of the fountain, needing a moment to steady the tremor in my hands. My mother made her choices, I said slowly. I do not think she meant to hurt either of us. She thought she was protecting me from uncertainty. She believed love could not survive the distance between two young people who barely had more than a pocketful of hope. She never understood that sometimes hope is exactly what keeps us alive. Seb sat beside me, his shoulder near mine but not touching. You were the kind of woman who deserved the whole truth, he said softly. I am sorry the truth reached you too late. We sat for a long moment in silence, listening to the fountain's quiet rhythm. I found myself thinking of Harold, of his steady presence, of the years that had shaped me as a wife and mother. He had been a good man, and I felt no regret for the life we shared. Yet now, sitting beside the man who had once carried my youth in his hands, I felt the weight of all the paths life could have taken, and the curious tenderness of being offered a new one so late in the journey. When the reception music grew louder, drifting out through the open doors of the hall, Seb stood and extended a hand. Come, he said. There is something else we should talk about before the evening grows too long. We walked toward the path that curved behind the mansion. Guests were beginning to flood out of the main hall, their voices rising in excited waves as champagne loosened their limbs. The air shimmered with laughter and clinking glassware. As we came into view, heads turned again. I could feel the shift in the atmosphere, the subtle readjusting of social hierarchies. A pair of women in glittering dresses paused their conversation as we passed. One leaned toward the other with a hushed whisper that still carried enough for me to hear. Who is he? And why is he with her? The other woman's eyes narrowed as she studied Seb's posture, his suit, the way he carried himself. Someone important. Someone powerful. I felt no triumph at their change in tone. Only a quiet, steadying calm. It was the first time in years I felt neither invisible nor out of place. We approached the archway leading to the garden bar where servers were refreshing the champagne glasses. Guests began lining up near the polished wooden counter, and the conversations continued to buzz around us like restless bees. Just as we stepped near the corner, I heard a familiar voice call from behind. Mom, can we talk? I turned to see Bryce walking toward us, his young wife at his side, her smile stretched tight with unease. Bryce's hair was slightly tousled from the wind, and his collar was askew, as though the last few hours had shaken something in him. I felt Seb's presence beside me, not protective but steady, an anchor I had not expected. Bryce's eyes flickered toward him, then back to me, confusion knitting his brow. Mom, he repeated, his voice softer now. Can we talk for a moment? Alone? I studied my son's face, searching for the boy who used to run into the kitchen shouting my name as though I were the only person in the world who mattered. But what I saw now was a man wrestling with the realization that his understanding of me, of himself, and of the values he had been embracing might have been built on fragile ground. Before I could respond, Camille stepped forward, her voice crisp. This is our wedding day. We should be celebrating, not entertaining uninvited guests. Her eyes flicked to Seb with a thinly veiled irritation that bordered on panic. She had grown accustomed to commanding social dynamics, to knowing who mattered in every room. But in this moment, she seemed suddenly unsure, as though someone had rearranged the rules without asking her permission. Seb met her gaze with a cool composure. I am not here to intrude, Miss Devon. I am here because your husband's mother deserves better. The color drained slightly from her polished face. Her mouth opened, then closed, as if she were searching for a response that would not betray her discomfort. Bryce placed a hand on her arm, trying to soothe her rising tension. It's fine, Camille. I just need a moment with my mother. I felt a subtle tremor pass through my body, not from fear but from the weight of a decision I had not prepared for. I turned to Seb. His gaze was steady, encouraging. I will be right here, he said softly. I nodded once, then followed my son to a quieter spot near the rose bushes. The scent of blossoms drifted around us, mingling with the faint salt of the lake breeze. Bryce hesitated before speaking, as though gathering the courage to form words that had been held back for far too long. Mom, he said finally, I'm sorry. I know that does not fix everything, but I am sorry. I should not have let them seat you back there. I should not have stayed quiet. For a moment I saw the boy he had once been, the boy who had cried when he got his first failing grade, who had hugged me tightly after his father's funeral, who had promised he would always protect me. And I saw the man he was now, struggling beneath layers of pride, expectation, and the pressure of fitting into a world that measured worth by dollars and pedigree. I placed a hand on his arm, feeling the tension beneath his skin. "I am not angry," I said softly. "I am disappointed." "That is different. Anger fades. Disappointment lingers until it is answered with truth." He nodded, his eyes glistening with something that looked dangerously like regret. "I do not want to lose you," he said. I did not realize how far I had drifted. "You drifted," I replied, "because you forgot who you were before the world told you who to be, and you forgot who I was before the world told you who I was allowed to be." He dropped his gaze, the words landing heavily on his conscience. When he finally looked up again, his voice trembled ever so slightly. "What do you need from me to fix this?" I paused, letting the question settle. The truth was simple, but not easy. "I need respect," I said. "Not performance, not apology delivered for show. Real respect. I need my place in your life to be chosen, not assigned. And I need you to remember that your mother is not a blemish on your reputation." Silence stretched between us, warm and thick. Then he whispered, "I can do that." Before I could reply, Camille approached, her expression a careful blend of charm and strain. "Bryce, the photographer is waiting for us," she said, her eyes darting briefly to me, then to the spot where Seb stood in the distance. Her tone softened slightly, though tension lingered beneath the surface. "Mrs. Carter," she added, "we should all try to move past the unpleasantness of earlier. This day is important to our families." I met her gaze steadily. "This day is important," I agreed. "But the measure of a family is not where they place someone in the seating chart. It is how they treat the people they claim as their own." Her posture stiffened, though she said nothing more. Bryce cleared his throat, murmured something to her, and they both walked back toward the crowd. I returned to Seb, each step carrying a strange mixture of heaviness and relief. When I reached him, he offered a gentle smile. "You handled that with grace," he said. I exhaled, the breath trembling slightly. "I did what I could." "And you did it well." Beyond us, the reception had begun in earnest. Music swelled. Guests danced. Laughter drifted through the air. Yet beneath it all, I felt something shifting, something subtle but powerful, as though the ground beneath my life had begun to tilt toward a new horizon. Seb held out his hand. "Come," he said, "let us leave the noise behind. There is more I wish to share with you." And as we walked toward the quiet path leading away from the estate, I felt the weight of the past slowly begin to loosen, making room for something I had not felt in years. The sky had shifted into a deeper shade of amber by the time Seb and I stepped away from the reception grounds. The music softened behind us, muffled by distance as though the celebration belonged to another world entirely. The gravel path curved toward a quiet clearing where old maples stood tall, their branches reaching over the walkway like guardians of a secret. The noise of clinking glasses faded until only the soft rhythm of our steps remained. For a long moment we walked without speaking, the kind of silence that forms not from awkwardness, but from the weight of something approaching. I sensed that whatever had begun in the hall was far from over. The air felt charged with an unspoken truth, as if the ground beneath us was preparing to reveal a fault line. Seb finally stopped near an iron bench shaded by a sweeping maple. The leaves above us rustled gently, whispering in a language older than any human grief. He rested one hand on the bench's curved back, his posture composed but not entirely relaxed. There was a flicker of conflict in his eyes, the kind that only appears in people who are used to making difficult decisions, yet still feel the human cost of them. "Mabel," he said quietly, "there is something I need to ask before we go any further. Something I must understand, for both our sakes." His voice had taken on a gravity that made the wind still around us. I lifted my chin slightly, waiting. "What do you want to do with the pain they caused you today?" The question struck with unexpected precision. Not what had happened, not how I felt, but what I wanted to do with the hurt. It was a question that separated reaction from choice, injury from response. I looked away, toward the line of roses trimmed neatly beside the hedge. Their petals glowed faintly in the descending light, soft and yet edged with thorns. For much of my life, I had believed in swallowing pain quietly, believing that silence was the price women paid to keep households at peace, but today had unsettled something fundamental in me. I felt the echo of humiliation still lingering behind my ribs, not as a wound but as a truth demanding to be faced. "I do not want to hurt them," I said finally. "That is not who I am. But I cannot pretend what they did was small. I cannot shrink myself to make them feel comfortable. And I cannot let them believe that their choices were harmless." Seb nodded slowly. His expression held no triumph, no eagerness, only the steady respect of someone who recognized the importance of a crossroads. "That is the answer I hoped for," he said. "You deserve dignity, not vengeance. But dignity, when denied, sometimes requires consequence." I studied him then, more carefully than before. There was an edge beneath his calm, a quiet force sharpened by years of navigating power. This was not the boy who once read poetry with trembling enthusiasm. This was a man who had built something formidable, whose decisions could shift the fortunes of others, and who now stood before me with an unwavering conviction. "We are not finished with them," he said softly. "Not yet." I felt no fear, only a slow, stirring strength. Before I could ask what he meant, footsteps sounded behind us, sharp, determined, urgent. I turned and saw Bryce and Camille striding toward the clearing, their faces tight, their movements tense, as though they were rushing to extinguish a fire they barely understood. Camille's gown snagged slightly on the grass, but she did not stop to adjust it. Her eyes were fixed on Seb with a kind of icy precision, the kind born from people accustomed to controlling narratives and unsettled when they lose control. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice cold enough to frost glass. Seb straightened, adjusting his tie with the quiet elegance of a man who did not need to raise his voice to command a room. "Someone who once mattered a great deal to Mabel," he answered evenly. The words hung in the air, heavy with implications. Camille's expression flickered between disbelief and offense. Bryce's eyes widened, confusion and alarm washing through him, as if he were struggling to assemble an image from scattered fragments. "This is our wedding," Camille said sharply. "Not a place for strangers to impose themselves." Before Seb could reply, I stepped forward. "Camille, you are speaking to my guest, and he is not a stranger." The quiet firmness in my tone startled even me. It was not loud, but it carried the authority of someone who had finally reclaimed her voice. Seb's slight nod told me he had been waiting for me to stand on my own feet, even as he stayed close enough to steady me if needed. Camille's chest rose and fell with a quick breath. She turned her attention back to Seb, trying to regain control. "Whatever you think you are doing here," she said, "this is a family celebration. We would appreciate it if you stepped aside so we can resolve this privately." Seb did not move. Instead, he spoke in a calm, measured tone that carried more weight than anger ever could. "Miss Devon, perhaps you should worry less about who stands beside your mother-in-law and more about how you treat her." Her mouth parted in shock. Bryce stepped forward, hands raised slightly as though to soften the blow. "Wait," he said quickly, trying to collect himself. "There has been a misunderstanding. Mom was placed in the last row because of a mix-up. The staff must have misread the seating plan. No one intended for her to be humiliated." I faced my son then, truly faced him, holding his gaze until his defenses faltered. "A mix-up or a choice?" I asked quietly. "Which was it, Bryce?" He hesitated, and in that hesitation the truth revealed itself. His lips pressed together, his shoulders sagged ever so slightly, and his eyes lowered as if he could not bear the weight of his own answer. Camille jumped in, her voice sharp but trembling at the edges. "Mabel, I think you are being too sensitive. Everything was chaotic, and you know our family values reputation. We could not risk anything that would cause embarrassment." Reputation. The word cut through the air like a blade. I felt it pierce something deep inside, the old wound of being treated as an inconvenience. Seb stepped closer, his presence a calm force behind me. "If your reputation is built on diminishing others," he said, "then perhaps you should reconsider what you believe reputation means." A flush rose beneath Camille's expensive foundation. Whether from shame or anger, I could not tell. Bryce tried again, his voice strained. "Mom, please, let us talk about this after the wedding. Let us not make a scene." A scene. The phrase echoed painfully in my ears. It was the same tone used by people who value comfort over truth, silence over dignity. "I am not here to make a scene," I said slowly. "I am here because this was my son's wedding, and I was treated as though I did not belong." Seb's voice followed, firm but polite. And because actions have consequences, Mr. Carter, especially actions done in the name of social status. Before either of them could respond, Seb slipped one hand into his pocket with a gesture that seemed almost casual. He spoke with a calmness that made my pulse quicken. "As it happens," he said, "2 weeks ago my firm, Whitmore Capital, finalized an acquisition. The building on Michigan Avenue where the Devon Realty headquarters are located now belongs to us." A stillness fell over the garden, so sudden and complete that even the leaves overhead seemed to pause. Camille's eyes widened. "The building on Michigan Avenue." She sounded as if the ground had tilted under her feet. "You mean our building?" Seb nodded once. "Yes. The deal closed last week." Her breath caught audibly. Bryce's face drained of color. Their carefully constructed social world had begun to tremble, the foundation cracking beneath the weight of truth. Seb's tone remained calm, almost gentle. "I did not plan to discuss business today, but since respect seems to be tied to status in this family, perhaps this is the appropriate moment for clarity." He turned to me then, offering a small smile, one that held reassurance rather than triumph. "Mabel, would you like to leave now?" The question was simple, but the meaning behind it was enormous. I could stay and continue to fight for acknowledgement in a place that had refused it. Or I could walk away, choosing myself rather than the approval of those who had belittled me. For the first time that day, I felt light. I lifted my chin, met my son's anxious gaze, and said, "Yes, I think I would." And with Seb's hand steady in mine, we turned toward the path leading out of the estate while the whispers behind us swelled like a rising tide. No one dared to call after us, no one dared to stop us. In the quiet that followed, a single truth settled in my heart with the clarity of a bell. This was the moment I chose my own dignity over the weight of their expectations. The moment I stepped out of the shadow of their judgment. The moment I realized that the last row had never been my place, unless I allowed it to be. The evening deepened as Seb and I walked away from the manicured grounds of the estate. The rising moon cast a pale glow over the path, turning the gravel into tiny fragments of silver. Behind us, the soft hum of distant conversation drifted like a fading echo, a world that no longer held me hostage. The cool air touched my cheeks, and for the first time in many years I felt something settle inside me, something steady and firm. It was the weight of my own worth, finally recognized by the person who needed to recognize it most, myself. Seb drove us to a quiet garden behind the mansion, a place where lavender bushes swayed in the evening breeze. As we stepped into the open space, the scent rose around us, warm and soothing, like a gentle balm laid over a raw wound. We sat on a stone bench near a pond, its surface shimmering with the reflections of the sky. Fireflies glowed like drifting embers above the water. For a moment, neither of us spoke. It felt as though the world had folded into this quiet corner, far removed from humiliation, expectation, and the heavy demands of social appearance. Seb broke the silence first. "Mabel," he said in a tone soft enough to be a whisper, "what happened today should never have happened. You were treated without dignity. You were placed where they believed you belonged, not where you deserved to be. I want you to know that what you endured was real, and the pain is valid." The gentleness in his voice made something tighten in my chest. I looked down at my hands resting on my lap, the remnants of tremor still faint beneath my fingers. "I thought I had prepared myself for anything," I said quietly. "I knew Camille never cared for me. I knew her mother saw me as an obstacle, an inconvenience, but I never thought my own son would let them treat me like that." His silence hurt more than their words. Seb nodded, his eyes reflecting the shimmering pond. Silence from those we love most can be a deeper cut than any insult. It is the abandonment of protection when we need it most. I turned toward him, unable to hide the ache in my voice. Why is it that the people we sacrifice for so often forget the cost of what we give? He smiled sadly. Because they mistake sacrifice for duty, and duty for something that exists without effort. They forget because you taught them to feel safe, and safety is often mistaken for permanence. A breeze rippled across the pond, scattering the reflection of the moon into soft waves. I felt as though the water mirrored something within me, a long-standing illusion breaking apart to reveal the truth beneath. Seb shifted slightly, drawing closer, his voice deep and steady. "Mabel, I cannot change the years you lived in silence, or the weight you carried alone, but I can stand with you now, and I can help you reclaim what was taken from you. Not out of vengeance, but out of justice." His words were not dramatic. They were calm, deliberate, and honest. They felt like a promise made not in passion, but in understanding. I met his gaze. The sincerity there was unmistakable. "What are you planning, Seb?" He leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. For years, the Devon family has built their reputation on status and appearance. They believed they could treat people as though their worth were measured by wealth. Today they humiliated the wrong person, and they did it in front of the wrong man. His tone had changed slightly. It remained gentle with me, but beneath it lay a quiet steel, the kind that only comes from someone accustomed to navigating power in silence. "I am not attacking your son," he continued. "Bryce is lost, not malicious. But Camille and her mother understand only one language: consequence. And consequence is exactly what they will face." I inhaled, feeling a mix of fear and an unexpected rising strength. "What kind of consequences?" "The kind that teaches, not destroys," Seb answered. "The kind that forces reflection, not retaliation. They will realize that dignity cannot be bought, and the people they dismiss may hold the kind of power they do not understand." My hands trembled slightly. I had never asked for power, never sought it, never imagined being entangled with it, but Seb's presence made the unfamiliar feel less frightening. He reached out and covered my hand gently. "I will not take a single step without you. This is your story, Mabel. Your voice, your choice. I am simply standing where I should have stood 50 years ago." The tenderness in his words dissolved the last bit of fear clinging to my heart. Before I could reply, the sound of hurried footsteps interrupted us again. Bryce appeared at the edge of the clearing, his face pale, his expression torn between panic and guilt. Camille followed behind him, her breath sharp, her eyes flashing with accusation. "Mom," Bryce said, his voice raw. "Please, can we talk? Not here, not with him, just you and me." His glance at Seb carried a defensive edge, the kind a man uses when he senses his influence slipping. I rose slowly, steadying myself. Bryce looked at me with desperate eyes, the eyes of a child seeking shelter in a storm he helped create. "We can talk," I said gently, "but not the way you think." He swallowed hard. I waited for him to speak, but it was Camille who stepped forward, her tone sharp and brittle. "You are blowing this out of proportion, Mabel. Whatever happened today is being twisted into something it is not, and now your friend is dragging business into it. Do you know who he is? Do you know what this could do to us?" Her fear was not of wrongdoing, but of losing control, and somewhere within me, something firmed. I looked at her calmly. "Yes, Camille, I know exactly who he is, and the question is not what this will do to you. The question is what your actions have already done to me." She flinched at the words, as though hearing them spoken aloud made the truth undeniable. Bryce ran his hand through his hair in frustration. "Mom, please, let us fix this. Let us talk in private. We do not want things to escalate." The irony of the plea struck me. They feared escalation now that power no longer sat solely in their hands. I met my son's gaze. The disappointment there was overshadowed by something more important than anger. "Bryce, this is not about punishment. This is about respect. You allowed me to be belittled in silence. You let strangers decide where I belonged. And when I looked to you, you looked away." His voice broke. "I know, Mom. I know. And I am ashamed of it. But I am asking you to stop this before it goes too far." Seb rose beside me, silent until this moment. He spoke with clarity, not menace. "It has already gone as far as it needs to, Mr. Carter. What happens next is not retaliation, it is accountability." Bryce stared at Seb as though seeing him fully for the first time. "You are doing this because of some old story between you and my mother." Seb did not flinch. "I am doing this because your mother deserved respect long before today. I am doing this because she spent a lifetime giving love to people who forgot the value of it. And I am doing this because if I had not found her again, I would not have forgiven myself." The silence that followed was immense. It felt like an entire world had exhaled and gone still. Finally I spoke, my voice soft but unwavering. "I am leaving, Bryce. Not to punish you, but to protect myself. When you are ready to speak to me with truth, I will listen. But not today." He stared at me, wounded yet understanding. I saw the little boy he once was, the one who used to run into my arms after school, replaced now by a man facing the consequences of forgetting where he came from. I took Seb's arm, and together we walked away from the clearing. The night air felt cooler, lighter, as though each step untangled a thread that had held me bound for decades. Behind us, I heard Bryce whisper my name, broken and quiet. But I did not turn back. Not out of cruelty, but because I finally understood something profound. Sometimes the most loving thing a mother can do is stop shrinking so her child can grow. As we reached the path leading to the car, Seb squeezed my hand gently. "You did more than stand your ground," he said. "You chose yourself." For the first time in years, I felt tears gather not from sorrow but from release. "I chose myself," I whispered back. And with that truth blooming in my chest, we stepped into the night, leaving behind the last fragments of a silence that had ruled my life for too long. The night outside the estate felt like a vast and quiet ocean, a place where the burdens of the day could finally loosen their grip. As Seb and I stepped into the car, the engine hummed softly, a low and steady vibration that steadied my breath. The headlights cast long beams across the winding driveway, illuminating rows of manicured hedges that now looked strangely distant, like relics of a life I no longer wished to belong to. For a long moment we drove without speaking. The silence was not empty but full, carrying the weight of everything that had happened and everything that was still unfolding. The city lights shimmered ahead like a horizon of possibilities waiting to reveal themselves. Seb glanced at me gently. "Are you all right?" I turned my face toward the window, watching the trees flicker past like ghosts of old seasons. "I think so," I said softly. "It feels like I stepped out of a chapter I never truly belonged in. But there is something else." "What is that?" I breathed slowly, letting the truth form with care. "I am frightened, Seb. Not of them, not anymore. I am frightened of what comes next. I do not know this version of myself. I have spent so many years holding my breath, shrinking myself, waiting for a place to belong. And now that I have stepped forward, I am not sure who I will become." Seb's hands tightened slightly on the wheel, his voice low with certainty. "You will become the woman you were always meant to be. Not shaped by others, but by your own truth. You are not stepping into the unknown alone. I am here, and I intend to stay." A warmth spread through my chest like the gentle flare of a candle's first light. I had not realized how deeply I needed to hear those words, how long it had been since someone had stood with me without expecting anything in return. The city opened before us as we reached the heart of Chicago. Tall buildings rose like steel pillars engraved with the stories of countless lives. Street lamps cast soft halos onto the sidewalks, where small groups of people walked, their laughter echoing into the night. Seb turned into a quiet street near Lake Michigan and parked beside a small garden overlooking the water. The lake stretched out like a vast sheet of obsidian, its surface rippling under the moonlight. The wind carried the faint scent of lavender mixed with the crisp scent of early autumn. He stepped out and walked around to open my door. The simple gesture, offered without flourish or expectation, made something flutter inside me. I took his hand and stepped out of the car. The air felt cooler here, the kind of cold that clears the fog of heavy thoughts. We walked toward a stone path along the water's edge. The moon reflected on the surface like a silver coin resting at the bottom of a well. The city lights painted faint ribbons across the lake, shimmering gently each time the wind brushed the waves. Seb spoke softly. "Do you remember the last time we walked by a lake together?" A faint smile touched my lips. "A long time ago." He nodded. "You were holding a book of poems, and you read aloud until the sun dipped below the horizon. Your voice carried over the water, and I remember thinking that nothing in the world had ever sounded so sure." I looked at him, surprised. I did not know you remembered it that vividly. His gaze softened. "Mabel, I remember everything. Some memories stay etched in us, not because of what happened, but because of who we were when they happened. You were young, full of light, full of conviction. You may think you have lost that, but you have not. Today proved it." A quiet tremor spread through me as I took in his words. Perhaps it was not courage I had lost, but the belief that anyone would see it. We reached a small iron bench facing the lake. The metal felt cool beneath my palms as I sat. Seb remained standing for a moment, looking out over the water as though contemplating the weight of something unspoken. Then he turned toward me. "They will face consequences for what they did," he said gently. "Not out of spite, but because they need to understand the cost of their choices. And because you deserve a world where your dignity is not negotiable." I breathed slowly, letting the meaning settle. There was no triumph in his tone, no pleasure at the thought of retribution. Only justice, offered like a quiet remedy for a long-neglected wound. Seb sat beside me, his shoulder close but not touching mine. The wind brushed my hair lightly, and I tucked a stray strand behind my ear. "I do not want to become someone hardened by bitterness," I said softly. "I have seen what bitterness can do. It corrodes the soul, it steals joy, and blinds us to kindness. I do not want that." Seb nodded. "Then do not carry bitterness. Carry truth. Carry strength. Carry self-respect. Consequence is not the same as vengeance. You are not punishing them. You are restoring the balance they disrupted." His words felt like a warm hand placed carefully over an old scar. I turned my gaze back to the lake. When I was seated in that last row today, I felt something crack inside me. It was not just humiliation, it was a realization that I had spent too long believing I needed to earn a place in my son's new world. But today I understood that the price they asked was not love or kindness. It was my self-worth. And I cannot give that away. Seb smiled gently. "That realization is the turning point, Mabel. The moment a person refuses to surrender themselves for the comfort of others is the moment they reclaim their life." The moon slipped behind a thin veil of clouds, casting a softer light across the water. I breathed deeply, letting the cool air fill my lungs. "What happens next?" I asked. He leaned back slightly, watching the clouds drift. "Tomorrow, the real battle begins. And you will not fight it alone." I closed my eyes and let the sound of the water steady my breath. Tomorrow felt like a distant mountain I had not yet climbed. But for the first time in many years, I felt capable of reaching its peak. Seb spoke again, his voice low, warm, and certain. "Tonight, rest your heart. Tomorrow, we step into the storm with a clear mind and a steady spirit. And when we walk out on the other side, you will not be the woman they tried to diminish. You will be the woman who rose." I opened my eyes and looked at him, feeling the quiet strength of his presence. "I think I am ready," I whispered. He gave a small nod. "Then dawn will find us prepared." The lake shimmered softly as though approving, and the night wrapped itself gently around us. It was not the end of the storm, it was the calm before the true beginning. The morning after our quiet walk by the lake arrived with a soft and muted sky, the kind that seems to understand a person's need for clarity. Sunlight pushed gently through a veil of pale clouds, touching the tops of the houses and the gardens with a tender glow. I stood at my kitchen counter, hands wrapped around a warm cup of tea, letting the steam rise against my face. My thoughts drifted back to the events of the previous night, the words spoken, the truths uncovered, and the shift in my heart that felt irreversible. I realized that what frightened me most was not confrontation, nor consequence. It was stepping into a version of myself I had long abandoned, a version that did not shrink before judgment, a version that did not apologize for taking up space. The years had trained me to live small, to avoid waves, to keep peace at any cost. But something inside me was waking. It felt like rising after years of kneeling. The doorbell rang softly. I opened it to find Seb standing there, already dressed in a charcoal suit, the morning light catching the silver in his hair. He looked composed, steady, and quietly certain. His presence settled something inside me. "Are you ready?" he asked. I nodded. "I think I have been ready longer than I realized. I just needed someone to stand beside me while I took the first step." Seb offered me his arm, and together we stepped out into the fresh morning air. The city awaited us, not as an adversary, but as a witness. What was coming next was not a battle of anger, but a declaration of self-worth. And for the first time in many years, I walked forward with my head high, not as someone trying to fit into someone else's world, but as someone finally stepping into her own. The day the final papers were signed for the scholarship fund was quiet, almost unremarkable in its simplicity. There were no grand announcements, no fanfare, no cameras. Only a soft autumn light filtering through the windows of Whitmore Capital's conference floor and the steady hum of the city below. Yet in that moment, something profound shifted inside me. The contract bearing Harold's name lay before me, its ink still fresh, its promise unmistakable. His legacy, once held only in memories and late-night whispers, now lived in a legal document that would touch young lives long after I was gone. As I signed my name beside Seb's, I felt a warmth rise through my chest, not bright like triumph, but deep like peace. I whispered Harold's name in my heart and hoped that somewhere, in the quiet corners of eternity, he knew that the love we built had found a new shape. After the meeting, Seb and I walked slowly through the lobby. Something about the way he carried himself made people step aside with quiet respect. Yet his hand at my back was gentle, guiding me not as someone fragile, but as someone cherished. Outside, the wind carried the scent of early winter. Leaves rustled across the pavement like small messengers, whispering of change. Seb paused beside the car and turned toward me. "Mabel, we have walked through the hardest part. What remains now is not a fight, but a choice. A choice about how you want to live the years ahead." I took in his words, letting their meaning settle. For decades, my life had been shaped by responsibility, by motherhood, by marriage, by silence. But now, for the first time since I was a young woman reading poems by the lake, the future felt like an open road, unwritten and waiting. "What choice is that?" I asked. Seb smiled softly. "The choice to live, not as someone defined by what others think, but as someone who chooses her own horizon. I want you to come with me to Tuscany, not as an escape but as a beginning." The idea seemed too large for a single breath. Italy felt distant, like a dream spun from another life. But as I looked into Seb's eyes, I saw not a grand adventure, but a quiet invitation. A chance to rediscover the parts of myself I had tucked away. I hesitated only long enough to feel the truth rise. Then I said the words that felt like opening a door I had kept shut for half a lifetime. "Yes, I will go." Seb exhaled with a tenderness I had not seen in years. He lifted my hand and kissed it lightly, not as a gesture of romance, but of gratitude. Gratitude that I had chosen myself. Weeks later, as my plane touched down in Florence, the horizon spread before me like a painting. Warm earth, rolling vineyards, sunlight spilling over ancient stone homes. The air held the scent of olives and lemons. It felt like stepping into a world that had been waiting patiently for my arrival. Seb met me at the airport, holding a small bouquet of lavender. As we drove through the winding countryside, I watched the fields stretch endlessly, each turn revealing new colors, new textures, new possibilities. When we reached the small village he had spoken of, Montefiore, I stepped out onto the cobblestone path. The world was quiet here, not empty, but calm. People greeted us with nods and warm smiles. The bells of a distant chapel rang softly, their echoes rolling across the hills like a blessing. Seb led me to a stone terrace overlooking vineyards that glowed gold in the afternoon sunday. A gentle wind lifted my hair. The moment felt impossibly still, as if held in the hands of something tender and eternal. "This," he said quietly, "is where I want our next chapter to begin." I stood beside him, my hands resting on the cool stone, my eyes taking in the sweeping view. I felt no fear, only the quiet certainty that comes from making the right choice at last. I turned toward Seb. For the first time in many years, I allowed myself to smile fully, without restraint. "Let us begin," I said. As the sun lowered behind the hills, casting long shadows across the valley, I realized that life had offered me something rare. Not a second chance at youth, not a fairy tale, but a gentler truth. Dignity reclaimed, love rediscovered, a horizon chosen freely. And as I breathed in the warm Tuscan air, I understood the message I wanted to leave for anyone who had ever been seated in the last row of their own life. Stand up, step forward. Your worth is not given, it is claimed. And once you claim it, no one can take it from you again.